November 1944. The autumn rain hammered against the windows of the military stockade in Chalons-sur-Marne, France, as Lieutenant Colonel James "Reckless" Murphy sat in his cell, staring at the bare concrete walls that had become his world for the second time in 8 months. Outside, the war raged on without him. But inside these walls, time stood still except for the constant reminder that his military career was hanging by the thinnest of threads. Murphy wasn't just any officer. At 32, he had already earned a reputation that preceded him into every room, every briefing, every battle. His nickname, Reckless, wasn't born from cowardice or incompetence. Quite the opposite. It came from an almost supernatural ability to see opportunities where others saw only obstacles, and an unwavering determination to act on those opportunities regardless of orders, protocol, or personal safety. Standing 6 feet tall with steel gray eyes and prematurely silver hair, Murphy carried himself with the bearing of a man who had stared death in the face so many times that they had become old acquaintances. His uniform, when he was allowed to wear it, bore the ribbons of the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 silver stars, and 3 purple hearts. But those decorations told only part of his story, the part his superiors were willing to acknowledge. First arrest had come in March 1944, during the brutal fighting in Italy. Murphy's battalion was pinned down by German machine gun nests that commanded the approach to Monte Battaglia, a strategic hilltop that Allied forces desperately needed to secure. For 3 days, conventional attacks had failed with devastating casualties. The division commander had ordered Murphy to hold his position and wait for artillery support that might not come for another 24 hours. Murphy looked at his men, kids mostly, some barely 18, lying in muddy foxholes, with fear etched on their faces, and made a decision that would define his career. While the rest of the division waited for orders, Murphy gathered 30 volunteers and led them on a night assault through terrain the enemy considered impassable. The plan was audacious beyond belief. Murphy's small force would scale the almost vertical northern face of Monte Battaglia, approach the German positions from the blind side, and attack with such surprise and ferocity that the enemy would collapse before they could organize effective resistance. It was the kind of plan that military academies use as examples of what not to do. Unless it works. For Murphy, failure wasn't an option. He had grown up during the Great Depression, watching his father struggle to keep their small farm in Oklahoma from foreclosure. He had learned early that sometimes the only choice was between taking an enormous risk and accepting certain defeat. That lesson had served him well from Normandy to the Gothic Line, and it would serve him again on the slopes of Monte Battaglia. The assault began at 02:00 hours on a moonless night in early March. Murphy and his volunteers climbed for 2 hours, through terrain so treacherous that one slip would mean a fall of hundreds of feet onto the rocks below. They carried no heavy weapons, only rifles, grenades, and an unshakable determination to succeed where others had failed. At 04:00 hours, Murphy's force struck the German positions like lightning from a clear sky. The enemy, confident that the northern approach was impossible, had concentrated their defenses facing south. Murphy's men swept through the hilltop positions, destroying 3 machine gun nests, capturing 2 artillery pieces, and killing or capturing 40 German soldiers before the enemy even understood what was happening. By dawn, Monte Battaglia was in American hands. The strategic hilltop that had cost the division dozens of casualties was secured without the loss of a single man from Murphy's assault force. The success sent shockwaves up the chain of command, but not all of them were positive. Major General Jeffrey Keyes, commanding the 2nd Corps, faced a dilemma. Murphy's unauthorized attack had achieved a crucial objective and saved countless American lives. But it had also completely violated the principle of military discipline that held armies together. If officers began launching independent operations without orders, the entire command structure could collapse into chaos. The solution was characteristically military. Murphy was simultaneously recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross and court-martialed for disobeying orders. The court-martial was a formality. Murphy's success made conviction impossible. But the 30 days he spent in confinement sent a clear message to other officers about the consequences of acting without authorization. Murphy emerged from his first arrest more determined than ever. The month in confinement had given him time to reflect on the nature of leadership and the terrible burden of command. He understood that his superiors faced impossible choices, balancing the need for discipline against the demands of combat effectiveness. But he also understood that sometimes lives could only be saved by men willing to risk everything on their own judgment. The second arrest came 6 months later. During the chaos of the Normandy breakout, Murphy's battalion was part of the massive offensive designed to shatter German resistance and liberate France. The plan called for a methodical advance, supported by overwhelming artillery and air power. Murphy was ordered to secure a crossroads village and wait for the main force to come up. What Murphy found when he reached the village was an opportunity too good to ignore. German resistance was lighter than expected, and his scouts reported that the enemy was in full retreat toward a major supply depot just 5 miles beyond their objective. If Murphy could reach the depot before the Germans organized their defenses, he could capture enough fuel and ammunition to supply an entire panzer division. The problem was that seizing the depot would require advancing beyond his assigned objective, leaving his flanks exposed and his rear unguarded. It was exactly the kind of unauthorized expansion of mission that military doctrine warned against. Murphy knew that if the attack failed, he would face not just another court-martial but possible charges of reckless endangerment. But Murphy also knew that war was about seizing opportunities, not following plans. The Germans were retreating in disorder, and a bold stroke now might save weeks of fighting later. He gathered his company commanders and laid out the situation with brutal honesty. They could follow orders and watch the enemy escape, or they could take a terrible risk for a chance at ending the war sooner. His officers voted unanimously to attack. The assault on the supply depot was a masterpiece of improvisation and audacity. Murphy's force, reinforced by a company of Sherman tanks that he borrowed from a neighboring unit, struck the depot at dawn while the German garrison was still organizing their defenses. The fighting was intense but brief. Within 3 hours, Murphy's men had captured 500,000 gallons of fuel, 200 tons of ammunition, and 40 German vehicles, including 2 Tiger tanks, in perfect working order. The strategic impact was enormous. The captured supplies eliminated a major German strongpoint and provided Allied forces with the resources they needed to maintain their advance. Murphy's unauthorized attack had shortened the war by an estimated 2 weeks and saved hundreds of Allied lives. But success couldn't protect Murphy from the consequences of his disobedience. This time, his court-martial was more serious. General Omar Bradley himself presided over the proceedings, and the charges included not just insubordination but theft of military property the Sherman tanks Murphy had borrowed without permission. The trial became a sensation in the military press. Murphy's defense was simple. He had acted in accordance with his understanding of military necessity and the principles of aggressive leadership. His prosecutor argued that discipline was the foundation of military effectiveness, and that Murphy's actions, however successful, threatened the entire command structure. The verdict was a compromise that satisfied no one. Murphy was found guilty of disobeying orders but acquitted of theft. He was sentenced to 60 days confinement and reduction in rank from lieutenant colonel to major. More importantly, his future in the army was placed in serious doubt. A third offense would mean the end of his career and possible criminal charges. It was during his second confinement that Murphy received an unexpected visitor. Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr., commander of the Third Army. Patton had heard about Murphy's exploits and wanted to meet the officer who had become famous for winning battles by breaking rules. The meeting between Patton and Murphy lasted 3 hours and remained classified for decades afterward. What emerged from their conversation was an understanding between two men who shared a fundamental belief in aggressive leadership and the importance of seizing opportunities in combat. When Murphy was released from confinement in November 1944, he found himself assigned to a new unit, the 502nd Special Operations Battalion, a classified organization that reported directly to Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower. The battalion's mission was to undertake operations to sensitive or dangerous for regular units, the kind of missions where success mattered more than following proper procedures. Murphy's first briefing with his new command was unlike anything he had experienced in 4 years of war. Colonel William Wild Bill Donovan, head of the Office of Strategic Services, outlined an operation so dangerous and complex that it seemed more like a suicide mission than a military objective. The target was Berchtesgaden, Hitler's mountain retreat in Bavaria. Intelligence sources indicated that the Führer was planning to make his final stand in the so-called National Redoubt, a fortress complex in the Alps that could extend the war for months or even years. The mission was to infiltrate the complex, capture or kill Hitler, and destroy the command structure that held the Nazi regime together. The plan was audacious beyond belief. Murphy would lead a force of 60 volunteers on a night insertion deep into enemy territory. They would approach Berchtesgaden through the mountains, avoiding German patrols and defensive positions, then assault the complex at dawn, when the garrison would be least prepared. Everything about the mission violated military doctrine. The force was too small to overcome serious resistance. The insertion would be made without air support or artillery backup. If the assault failed, there would be no possibility of rescue or reinforcement. The men who volunteered would be completely on their own, hundreds of miles behind enemy lines, facing the most fanatical defenders in the German military. Murphy studied the intelligence reports and aerial photographs for 2 weeks before accepting the mission. What he saw convinced him that conventional approaches were doomed to failure. Berchtesgaden was protected by multiple rings of defenses, manned by SS troops who would fight to the death. A frontal assault would require an entire division and would cost thousands of casualties, but a small force, moving with stealth and striking with complete surprise, might succeed where an army would fail. The volunteers who joined Murphy came from every branch of the military: paratroopers from the 101st Airborne, Rangers from the 2nd Ranger Battalion, commandos from the British Special Air Service, and OSS operatives trained in sabotage and assassination. They were united by a shared understanding that this mission would determine not just their own fates, but possibly the course of history itself. Training for the operation took place at a secret facility in Scotland, where Murphy's force learned mountain warfare, silent killing techniques, and the layout of Berchtesgaden from scale models built by intelligence specialists. Every man memorized his role in an operation that left no room for error or improvisation. The psychological pressure was enormous. These were men who had survived years of combat, but none had faced a mission with such slim chances of success. Murphy insisted on absolute honesty about their prospects. Intelligence estimates gave the mission a 30% chance of success and less than a 10% chance that any of them would survive to see the end of the war. But Murphy also understood what drove these men to volunteer. They were tired of war, tired of watching their friends die in battles that seemed to accomplish nothing. This mission offered something that had been missing from their experience: the chance to strike a blow that might end the killing and bring their brothers home. The insertion took place on the night of April 20th, 1945, Hitler's 56th birthday. Murphy's force was dropped by parachute into the Bavarian Alps, 30 miles from Berchtesgaden. The landing was scattered by high winds and mountainous terrain, but Murphy had planned for this contingency. Small teams would make their way to predetermined rally points and assemble for the final assault. The approach to Berchtesgaden took 12 hours of movement through some of the most treacherous terrain in Europe. Murphy's men climbed through snow and ice, avoiding German patrols and observation posts, maintaining radio silence to avoid detection. By dawn on April 21st, they had reached positions overlooking Hitler's mountain fortress. What they saw through their binoculars confirmed their worst fears. Berchtesgaden was defended by at least 200 SS troops, supported by anti-aircraft guns, machine gun nests, and fortified positions that commanded every approach. The complex was built into the mountainside itself, with concrete bunkers that could withstand direct hits from heavy artillery. But Murphy also saw opportunities. The defenders were concentrated around the main approaches, leaving the steepest sections of the mountain relatively unguarded. The SS troops appeared confident that no serious attack could come from the treacherous northern slopes. Most importantly, there was no indication that the garrison suspected an imminent assault. Murphy made the decision that would define his legacy. Instead of attempting a direct assault on the main complex, he would divide his force and attack from 3 different directions simultaneously. The plan required splitting his already small force into even smaller units, but it offered the best chance of achieving complete surprise. The assault began at 0600 hours with a diversionary attack on the main gate. 12 men, led by British SAS Captain David Stirling, opened fire on the guard posts and threw smoke grenades to create confusion. The defenders, thinking they were facing a small raiding party, rushed to reinforce the main perimeter. While the Germans were focused on the diversion, Murphy led the main assault force up the northern face of the mountain. 24 men climbed for 2 hours through terrain so steep that they had to use mountaineering ropes and pitons. At 0800 hours, they reached the rear of the complex and began their attack on Hitler's personal residence, the Berghof III. Element of Murphy's force, commanded by OSS operative Major John Wall, struck the communications center that coordinated defenses throughout the region. Their mission was to cut the telephone lines and radio transmissions that would allow the garrison to call for reinforcements. The battle that followed was unlike anything in Murphy's experience. The fighting was at close quarters, often hand, as his men cleared room after room of the sprawling complex. German resistance was fierce, and fanatically Guards fought to the death rather than surrender, turning every corridor into a killing ground. Murphy himself led the assault on Hitler's private apartments, expecting to find the Führer waiting for his final confrontation with destiny. What he found instead was empty rooms and clear evidence that Hitler had fled to Berlin days earlier. The intelligence that had justified this desperate mission was wrong. Hitler was not making his last stand in the mountains, but in his bunker, beneath the Reich Chancellery. The realization that their primary objective was unattainable should have ended the mission. Military doctrine called for immediate withdrawal when the original plan became impossible. But Murphy understood that failure to achieve the primary objective didn't mean the mission was worthless. Berchtesgaden was still the symbolic heart of the Nazi regime, and its capture would send a powerful message to both the German people and the world. Over the next 6 hours, Murphy's force systematically destroyed everything that represented Nazi power and ideology. They burned Hitler's personal library, smashed the furnishings of the Burghof, and demolished the communications equipment that coordinated SS operations throughout southern Germany. Most importantly, they captured classified documents that provided Allied intelligence with a complete picture of Nazi plans for post-war resistance. The psychological impact of the assault was enormous. News that American commandos had penetrated Hitler's personal sanctuary spread throughout Germany like wildfire. For ordinary Germans, the attack proved that their leaders could no longer protect even themselves. For Nazi officials, it demonstrated that nowhere was safe from Allied retribution. But the mission's success came at a terrible price. By the time Murphy's force withdrew from Berchtesgaden, 23 men were dead and 15 more were wounded. Only 22 of the original 60 volunteers made it back to Allied lines, and several of them died from their injuries in the days that followed. Murphy himself was critically wounded during the final phase of the assault when an SS guard detonated a grenade in a corridor filled with American soldiers. Shrapnel tore through his left leg and abdomen, leaving him barely conscious as his men carried him down the mountain toward the rally point. The extraction was a nightmare of pain and endurance. Murphy drifted in and out of consciousness as his men took turns carrying him through terrain that would have been challenging for a healthy man. Several times, German patrols came close to discovering their position, forcing the survivors to hide in caves and crevices while enemy soldiers searched the area. It took 3 days for Murphy's force to reach the extraction point, where Allied aircraft were waiting to fly them to safety. By then, Murphy had lost so much blood that the medical officer who examined him gave him less than a 50% chance of survival. But Murphy had survived too much to die on a mountain in Bavaria, and his iron constitution pulled him through the crisis. News of the Berchtesgaden raid reached Allied headquarters just as the war in Europe was entering its final phase. Hitler had committed suicide in his Berlin bunker. German resistance was collapsing on all fronts, and victory was only days away. In the context of these world-changing events, Murphy's mission seemed like a footnote to history. But the impact of the raid extended far beyond its immediate military consequences. The capture of Berchtesgaden proved that American forces could strike anywhere, anytime, regardless of enemy defenses or geographical obstacles. It demonstrated a level of operational sophistication and tactical audacity that impressed even hardened combat veterans. More importantly, the raid established a new model for special operations that would influence military thinking for decades to come. Murphy had shown that small forces, properly trained and led, could achieve objectives that would require much larger conventional units. His methods would be studied and copied by special forces organizations around the world. The personal cost of Murphy's career was enormous. His wounds from the Berchtesgaden raid left him with permanent disabilities that ended his active military service. The psychological trauma of losing so many men under his command haunted him for the rest of his life. He never fully recovered from the burden of having sent 38 young men to their deaths in pursuit of an objective that ultimately proved unnecessary. But Murphy's legacy extended far beyond his personal suffering. The 2 arrests that had nearly ended his career were forgotten in light of his final mission's success. Military historians who studied his unconventional methods concluded that his willingness to take risks and break rules had saved thousands of Allied lives during the war. In the years after the war, Murphy became a symbol of American military innovation and aggressive leadership. His techniques were incorporated into the training programs of elite units throughout the armed forces. Officers who had served under him carried his lessons to commands around the world. spreading his influence far beyond what he had achieved as an individual. The irony of Murphy's career was that his greatest success came from the same qualities that had gotten him arrested twice: his refusal to accept limitations, his willingness to take enormous risks, and his ability to see opportunities where others saw only obstacles, had made him both a problem for his superiors and an invaluable asset in combat. The final assessment of Murphy's military service came in 1946, when he was awarded the Medal of Honor for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty during the Berchtesgaden raid. The citation specifically praised his innovative tactical leadership and selfless devotion to duty in the face of overwhelming odds. Murphy died in 1967, 22 years after the war ended, still carrying shrapnel from the assault on Hitler's mountain fortress. His funeral was attended by former comrades from around the world, men who had served under him in battles, whose names were already fading from public memory. They came not to mourn a dead hero, but to honor a man who had shown them what was possible when courage and determination were combined with tactical brilliance and moral purpose. The story of the reckless officer who was arrested twice, but whose final mission shocked the world, became legend in the special operations community. It served as a reminder that sometimes the most valuable military assets are those who refuse to be constrained by conventional thinking or traditional methods. Murphy's career demonstrated that the difference between recklessness and courage often depends on results. His willingness to violate orders and ignore protocol had made him a disciplinary problem, but his ability to succeed where others failed had made him indispensable. In the end, the same qualities that got him arrested twice had also made possible the mission that shocked the world and helped end the deadliest war in human history. The lesson of Murphy's story was not that military discipline should be abandoned or that officers should routinely disobey orders. Rather, it was that exceptional circumstances sometimes require exceptional responses, and that the most valuable leaders are often those who understand when rules must be broken in service of a higher purpose. Today, Murphy's name is largely forgotten by the general public, but his methods continue to influence military operations around the world. The Special Forces units that trace their lineage to his innovations carry forward his legacy of aggressive leadership and tactical audacity. They serve as a reminder that sometimes the most effective way to shock the world is to refuse to accept the limitations that others take for granted.